they don't tell you this in school. They want you to believe Cleopatra's story ended with that snake bite in Alexandria, with Rome's triumph and Egypt's downfall. But that's not true, because hidden behind the smoke and marble of that tragedy was a little girl, Cleopatra Selene, her only surviving daughter. And here's the forbidden twist. While Rome paraded her through the streets as a prisoner, while her mother's empire turned to dust, Selene wasn't broken. No, she carried her mother's blood, her father's ambition, and she swore in silence that she would rebuild what had been stolen. And the secret no one expected. She did, against every odd, against Rome itself. This forgotten daughter of Cleopatra fought back not with armies, not with poison, but with brilliance, alliances, and the weight of her name. They wanted her erased. Instead, she rose from captivity to wear a crown. The fall of Alexandria was smoke, fire, and silence, all tangled together. Picture the great library's shadows stretching over the harbor, the ships of Octavian, the future Augustus, blocking every escape, and the sound of sandals slapping across marble floors as messengers carried word of betrayal after betrayal. Cleopatra, the last pharaoh of Egypt, had played her final hand with Mark Antony, and they had lost. The world remembers the way they did Antony's blade, Cleopatra's serpent, but almost no one remembers who was left behind, her daughter, Cleopatra. Selene was around 10 years old when the Roman legions stormed Alexandria. To be 10 in a palace like hers was to live in gold and terror at once. She had grown up in the splendor of Egypt's court, surrounded by columns painted with gods, courtiers bowing low, and a mother whose name made nations tremble. And then, in a matter of days, it all turned to dust. She watched as her father, Antony, fell on his sword after being told Cleopatra was dead. She watched her mother wrap herself in robes of purple, walk into her mausoleum, and never walk out again. And in the echo of that silence, Selene and her twin brother, Alexander Helios, were dragged from their palace and into Roman chains. Think about that. Imagine being a child, standing barefoot in the ruins of your home, the smoke of Alexandria clinging to your hair, the laughter of foreign soldiers ringing in your ears. She had lost not only her parents, but her kingdom, her future, the very ground beneath her feet. And worse, she was not an ordinary orphan. She was the daughter of Cleopatra and Mark Antony, Rome's greatest enemies. She should have been executed on the spot. But Augustus was too clever for that. He knew a public execution would make martyrs. Instead, he saved her, but not out of kindness. No, he saved her for spectacle. Months later, Selene found herself in chains, forced to march through the streets of Rome in Augustus's grand triumph. The city roared as gold treasures stolen from Egypt glittered in the sun, as painted floats mocked her parents' downfall, as wild animals from Africa roared in cages. And there, among the spoils, were the children Cleopatra's children paraded like trophies. Can you imagine the shame, the fury, the helplessness? Romans jeered at her mother's name, spat at her father's memory, and Selene, the little girl with royal blood, was made to bow before the mob. For most children, this would have broken them. For Selene, it carved fire into her bones. In that moment, in the heart of her humiliation, she learned her first great lesson. Rome might strip her of her kingdom, her parents, her freedom, but they could never strip her of her name. She was Cleopatra's daughter, and that meant something. After the triumph, she and her brothers were placed in the household of Octavia, Augustus's sister, the same woman Antony had once abandoned for Cleopatra. Think about that irony. The widow of her father's betrayal became her guardian. But Octavia was merciful in her way. She raised the children in Roman style, gave them education, clothing, tutors. It was safety, yes, but also surveillance. They were always reminders, always visible symbols of Rome's victory. For Selene, those years were a crucible. She learned Latin and Greek, studied philosophy and rhetoric, absorbed the sharp edges of Roman politics. She smiled when she was supposed to, bowed when expected, but inside she nursed her mother's memory like a flame. While other children dreamed of games and feasts, Selene dreamed of return, of rebuilding, of reclaiming what Rome had stolen, and the world began to notice her. By her late teens, she was not just a ward of the empire. She was a young woman of striking intelligence, poise, and ambition. Augustus himself recognized it. He could not risk her becoming a rallying figure for rebellion in Egypt, but he could use her as a tool, as a pawn in the great chessboard of empire. And so he made a choice that would change her life. He married her off. Not to a Roman, not to a senator or general, but to a client, King Juba II of Mauretania, a North African realm stretching across the deserts and coasts where Rome's influence was strong but not absolute to most. It looked like exile dressed as reward, but to Cleopatra Selene, it was something else entirely. For the first time since Alexandria burned, she saw a path not of chains, but of a crown. This was the beginning of her second life, the life of a queen, reborn not in Egypt, but in Africa. When Cleopatra Selene left Rome to marry Juba II, it was not as a free princess reclaiming her destiny, but as a carefully packaged political gift. Augustus tied a ribbon around her future and sent her west, far from the marble heart of his empire. Yet what Rome thought of as exile, Selene saw as opportunity. She had endured humiliation, captivity, and the loss of her parents' kingdom. But now, for the first time, she was given something Rome never intended her to keep, a crown. Juba II was no ordinary husband. He, too, had once been a captive. His father, Juba the first of Numidia, had fought Julius Caesar and lost, leaving his infant son in Roman hands. Raised in the empire, educated like a Roman noble, Juba became a loyal client king, Rome's carefully molded ally. By the time he wed Selene, he was already intelligent, cultured, and deeply Roman. To Augustus, pairing these two orphans of empire seemed perfect, one raised in Rome, the other tamed by Rome. Together, they would rule Mauretania as a Roman satellite state. But Selene was not content to be Rome's puppet. From the moment she set foot in Mauretania's coastal capital Caesarea, modern-day Churchill, she began reshaping it in her image. Imagine the young queen walking through streets of white stone, gazing at the raw edges of a kingdom half desert, half sea. Rome expected her to stay quiet, to serve as Juba's exotic wife, a symbol of Cleopatra's bloodline pacified under Augustus's control. Instead, she became something far greater. Together, she and Juba transformed Mauretania into a beacon of culture, trade, and learning. But it was Selene's touch that made it shine. She brought with her the splendor of Alexandria, the traditions of Egypt, the memory of a mother who had once called herself goddess and queen. Temples rose with a fusion of Egyptian, Greek, and Roman styles. Statues of Isis appeared beside Roman forums. Coins were minted not only with Juba's face but with hers equal in stature, equal in rule. That was a quiet act of defiance, a whisper to the world. She was not a forgotten prisoner. She was a queen in her own right. Picture those coins in your hand, silver denarii glinting in the African sun. Cleopatra Selene's profile, carved in sharp relief. Her name etched in Latin. To hold one was to hold proof that the daughter of Cleopatra had not been erased, and Mauretania thrived under her rule. Ports along the Mediterranean bustled with trade grain, purple dye, fish sauce, ivory, glassware flowing between Africa, Rome, and beyond. Scholars and artisans flocked to her court, where Egyptian astronomy met Roman architecture, where Greek learning mingled with Berber traditions. In every detail, from the mosaics on palace floors to the gold ornaments worn by courtiers, Selene's presence pulsed like a second heartbeat beside Juba's. But beneath this flourishing kingdom there was steel. Selene had not forgotten Rome's triumph, nor her humiliation in chains. Every temple she built, every coin she minted, was a statement of survival. And though she could not raise armies against Augustus, she raised something perhaps more dangerous: memory. She ensured her mother's legacy lived on through her reign, that Cleopatra's blood still ruled. Even if not in Egypt, whispers spread in Rome. Senators grumbled at the queen's prominence, muttering that Juba was too indulgent of his wife, that Cleopatra's daughter was shining too brightly on her African throne. But Augustus tolerated it so long as Mauretania stayed loyal, so long as the grain and taxes flowed. Selene, ever careful, walked the razor's edge. She played the dutiful client queen on the surface, while beneath, she spun a world where her name could never be forgotten. For her subjects, she became more than a queen. To the Berber tribes of the interior, she was a foreign empress who brought stability and prosperity. To Egyptians, still scattered in diaspora, she was a living link to their lost homeland. To women across the empire, she was a symbol of resilience. The girl who had once been paraded as a trophy, now ruling with dignity, power, and grace. And yet, the shadows never left her. She carried them in her blood, in her dreams. At night, perhaps, she remembered the cries of Alexandria, the jeers of the Roman mob, the cold stare of Augustus. Every triumph in Mauretania was laced with defiance. Every monument a whisper: I survived you. But survival had a cost. Rome's eyes were always watching. Juba, though intelligent and loyal, sometimes leaned too close to his Roman masters. Selene knew the danger. She had seen what happened when Rome turned on its allies, when loyalty was no longer convenient. Her kingdom, her children, her very legacy could vanish in a heartbeat if Augustus so willed it. And so she played the long game. She cloaked her fire in diplomacy, her ambition in culture. She built not armies, but monuments, not rebellions, but legacies. She created a world in which her name, and by extension Cleopatra's, could never be erased. Still, there was one thing she could not change: her exile from Egypt. For all her brilliance, all her triumph, she would never again set foot in Alexandria. Never kneel before the Nile's waters, never reclaim her mother's throne. That wound never healed. But Selene was not finished. Her story did not end with building a kingdom, because as her children grew, as her power deepened, new challenges rose. The tension between her past and her future. The question of whether she was Roman, Egyptian, African, or something entirely new. And above all, the shadow of Rome loomed larger with every passing year. The daughter of Cleopatra had rebuilt a kingdom, but could she keep it? By the time Cleopatra Selene entered her 30s, she had transformed Mauretania into a jewel of the Mediterranean. What had once been a provincial kingdom on Rome's edge now gleamed with marble, mosaics, and bustling trade, a crossroads where Africa, Rome, and the wider world collided. And at the center of it all sat a queen who had once been paraded in chains, now commanding a court that rivaled those of Rome's oldest dynasties. Imagine walking through Caesarea at its height. Ships crowded the harbors, their sails striped with colors of distant lands. Greek merchants from Athens, Egyptian sailors from Alexandria, Berber traders with ivory from the Sahara, Roman envoys bringing scrolls sealed in wax. The streets echoed with voices in Greek, Latin, Berber, and Punic, and high above it all rose the palace, with its marble steps lined by statues of gods that were neither wholly Roman nor wholly Egyptian, but something new, a fusion of cultures that reflected Selene herself. Inside those palace halls, Selene's influence was unmistakable. Juba was king, yes, but Selene was equal partner, her image minted on coins, her authority woven into decrees. She presided over councils, corresponded with scholars, and welcomed ambassadors with the sharp wit and regal poise she had inherited from her mother. To many, she was the true heart of Mauretania's power. Her children grew up in this world of brilliance and contradiction. They bore Roman names, spoke multiple languages, and were heirs not only to Mauretania, but to the tangled legacies of Antony, Cleopatra, and their Berber father. Selene poured herself into them, shaping them as heirs who would carry both her resilience and her ambition. Through them, she believed, her bloodline could survive beyond her lifetime, her mother's dream reborn in new form. But even as she built this shining world, the shadows of Rome never left her side. Augustus was aging now, his empire sprawling wider than any before, and his paranoia as sharp as ever. Selene knew he remembered her, knew he had not forgotten the humiliation of Antony and Cleopatra, the spectacle of her mother's death. As long as she lived, she remained both symbol and threat. That tension shaped every decision she made. She lavished honors on Augustus in her public ceremonies, raised statues to his name, and ensured her kingdom remained outwardly loyal. But beneath the surface, she built a realm that could stand on its own. Roads were cut through the mountains, linking coast to desert. Cities were adorned with theaters, forums, and temples that rivaled those of Rome itself. Knowledge flowed into her libraries, artisans into her workshops. If Augustus saw Mauretania as a client state, Selene envisioned it as a dynasty. And yet, her defiance was quiet, never open. She had learned from her mother's downfall. Rome crushed open rebellion, but subtle strength, cloaked in diplomacy that could survive. Still, whispers reached her ears. Senators in Rome muttered about that queen who wielded too much power, about how she minted coins with her own face, how she dared echo the legacy of her mother. For some, Cleopatra Selene was not a client queen, but a reminder of what Rome had once feared, A woman who could turn charm and ambition into empire. It is here, perhaps, that her story takes its most fascinating turn. For while Augustus tolerated her, history suggests there may have been limits. Some sources hint at tension between Rome and Mauretania, of sudden silences in the record, of Selene's name vanishing too abruptly from the chronicles. Did Augustus finally move against her? Did he fear she had grown too bold? We cannot say with certainty, but we know this. Selene's life was cut short. She died young, in her mid-30s, leaving her children to inherit the kingdom she had built. The news of her death rippled across the Mediterranean. For Rome, it was one less threat. For Mauretania, it was a shattering loss. For those who remembered Alexandria, it was the extinguishing of the last living flame of Cleopatra's house. But here is the twist. Though Selene died young, her legacy endured. The city she helped shape continued to thrive. The monuments she commissioned stood for generations, and her children, especially her son Ptolemy of Mauretania, carried her blood into the next century. He was the grandson of Cleopatra, the great-grandson of Antony, a living reminder that Rome had never fully erased her line. For Selene, that was victory enough. She had taken her humiliation, her chains, her exile, and turned them into a throne. She had defied Augustus, not with armies, but with endurance, not with poison, but with culture, not with rebellion, but with legacy. And perhaps, in her final years, as she walked the gardens of Caesarea under the African sun, she allowed herself a moment of quiet triumph. She had not reclaimed Egypt, but she had rebuilt a kingdom. She had turned memory into monument, humiliation into power. She had proven that the daughter of Cleopatra could not be erased. Her story is not one of tragedy alone. It is one of survival, defiance, and rebirth. And though her name is forgotten in most histories, lost beneath the shadow of her mother, those who look closely can see her fingerprints on the world she left behind. The forgotten daughter of Cleopatra had carved her place in history, not as a captive, but as a queen. Grief in Mauretania did not announce itself with wailing women or black veils, at least not at first. It arrived as a hush. Courtiers lowered their voices. Messengers walked more quickly, but spoke more slowly. The bronze doors of the palace sighed as if even metal understood that a page of history had turned too soon. And then, after the hush, came the ripples, the sudden absence of a presence, so commanding you only noticed it fully when it was gone. Cleopatra Selene died young. No one dared say those last two words in the open court, but the truth lived in the way the queen's dais sat empty, in the way a single chair at the council table remained pushed back as if the owner had stepped away for a moment and would surely return. Juba, to her husband and partner in statecraft, moved through the palace like a man walking in water, heavy, slow, resisting a tide that pulled without mercy. He had once been a prince, taken from his cradle to Rome, then a scholar king, then a ruler with a queen whose bloodline shook empires simply by existing. Now he was a widower who still turned, sometimes, as if to ask a question to the woman who would no longer answer, outside the palace walls. The streets of Caesarea city she had coaxed from provincial dust into marble brightness felt the loss like weather shifting. Merchants paused before lifting awnings. Dockworkers looked toward the palace hill and made the sign of their household gods. A baker laid out bread in twin pyramids one for sale, one for the soul of a queen whose mother had called herself goddess. In the great temple where Selene had fused Egyptian devotion with Roman form, priests of Isis and priests trained in the Roman rites together offered smoke and petitions. The smoke curled upward in two distinct streams, then braided into one. The official proclamations were precise and bloodless. The queen is at rest. The queen has gone to the field of reeds. The queen is received among honored ancestors. The queen's star has ascended. What they did not say, what could not be said, was that an inheritance of defiance and deftness had just slipped from flesh into story. You can tax grain and count ships and levy men, but you cannot measure the weight a single will carries until the will is removed. Even in death, Selene managed the stage, a procession wound from the palace to the sea, then back through the city's forums and colonnades, every district represented. Berber chieftains rode, with their spears blunted in mourning. Greek scholars followed, their scrolls bound in black ribbon. Egyptian artisans carried gold filigree panels. She had commissioned lotus and papyrus intertwined, while Roman envoys marched tight-faced, as though grieving in public were a diplomatic instrument with exact settings. Juba walked last, bareheaded, the sun making a crown of his hair he did not feel. If anyone had peered closely at the queen's bier, they would have found a decision carved into its very wood. The carpenters were ordered not by decree, but by habit formed under a queen's eye. Two alternate imagery: palm and laurel, lotus and oak, snake and eagle. Egypt and Rome, Mauretania and empire, destiny and design. Cleopatra's daughter had balanced worlds. Her funeral taught the lesson once more. The kingdom Selene left behind did not collapse. That was never her way. She had built structures capable of standing under other hands. Edicts bore both royal seals for years. Municipal charters specified councils that could function even if the palace were struck dumb. She had minted coins with her own name to teach subjects that a queen's authority was not borrowed but born. Now, those coins stayed in circulation long enough for children to learn her profile the way they learned constellations. Port customs continued to hum. Roads still carried caravans of salt and ivory. The academies she endowed still held disputations where astronomy glinted against philosophy like blade 2, whetstone, dot. And yet listen, under the continuities there ran a new sound, a hairline crack you could trace with a fingernail. For so much of Mauretania's balance had depended on Selena's sense of where precisely to place her weight. She knew when to flatter Rome and when to appear merely respectful, when to soothe a frontier clan with gifts of dyed wool, and when to send a cohort along the mountain pass, when to build a temple and when to dedicate a market, when to sign a letter, Regina Cleopatra Selene, and when to sign simply Selene, as if weightlessness were another form of power. She had the touch pianists later would envy, ability to press more than one truth at once and make harmony. The first test arrived like a messenger at dusk. A Roman prefect, newly posted to the African shore opposite Sicily, wrote with an authoritative pen and a stranger's ear. In light of the queen's passing, he expected tariffs to be adjusted in favor of Rome. The word hovered above the page as both request and demand. Juba read it, set it down, and turned to the empty chair. He did not speak, but he felt the shape of Selene's counsel. We are loyal allies, not provinces. Send wine and alabaster. Honeyed words and a hint of steel. Never concede the principle. Always feed the appetite. The reply went out on vellum, thick as a governor's pride. The tariff did not move. The prefect learned the right adjective, for Mauretania was steadfast, inland. A young chieftain decided the queen's death meant the old treaty could be tested. He had grown up hearing of Selene's feasts, and Selene's decrees, and Selene's soldiers, who came only when required. He misunderstood grace for softness. He raided a caravan, then another. The third time, the dust on the horizon was not traitors, but Mauretanian cavalry, glittering like a statement. The chieftain's tent collapsed with the first dawn wind after he knelt. Juba accepted his oath over a brazier of juniper branches. When the smoke rose, sweet and sharp, some swore they smelled lotus. The chieftain swore he saw a woman's shadow behind the king. People tell themselves what they need to keep faith. At court, Selene's children learned to carry themselves with a new geometry. Ptolemy, favorite of rumor-mongers, for the way his profile seemed to be drawn with an Alexandrian style. Into a prince people described with the adjectives they once used for his mother, considered, bright, precise. His sister cultivated a face that could listen an hour before blinking. In the evenings, Juba walked with them along the terrace that looked down over the harbor. He pointed to ships and told their stories, Carthaginian designs living in Roman hulls, Greek helmsmen who could smell cypress in a wind, a Berber family whose bones remembered the oldest track across the Atlas. "This is your kingdom," he would say. "And it is not a single thing," he never said. "It was your mother's kingdom first, because he did not need to. The palace said it every day. You could not move through a corridor without meeting Selene's decisions set in stone." In the library, a catalogue in Greek and Latin listed titles, including an astronomical text dedicated to the queen whose eyes measured the heavens in the mint. Dies lay in velvet trays, one engraved with a crescent that had become more than ornament. Selene's coinage had carried a moon as shorthand for her name and her inheritance. Now the symbol appeared, carved into lintels and painted above doorways, a private piety made public across a capital. It was not worship Selene had been too careful to avoid the charges that destroyed her mother, but it was reverence. People require constellations. She had given them one they could carry in a purse. Rome watched. It always did. The older Augustus became, the more he understood what he had long practiced. That stability is a theater with changing casts and a permanent script. Client kingdoms were instruments in the orchestra. If a clarinet grew too expressive, a conductor raised a finger. Selene's death removed the player Augustus most feared, improvising. He eased his hand. Proconsuls wrote fewer cautionary letters. Senators enjoyed dinners without the word Cleopatra thinning the wine. But the empire's appetite does not sleep. It merely changes its dress. Not long after Tiberius took the imperial seat, Rome glanced at the map with the old Roman gaze, one that sees borders as suggestions and suggestions as invitations. Ptolemy now wore his crown. His coins bore his name in neat Latin capitals. But sometimes, when the die cutter grew sentimental or subversive, a whisper of a crescent slipped in. He traveled to Rome to pay the respects the machine required. He sat in a curia under an emperor who preferred shadows to speeches. He learned, as Selene had known, that a bow at the right angle buys a year of peace. It could not buy forever. Historians love dates impalements for butterflies of memory, but people live through seasons. In one such season, in the reign of Caligula, Ptolemy visited Rome again. The emperor, who loved spectacle as drowning men love rafts, asked his cousin from Africa to wear a cloak so bright it left a stain in the eyes. Ptolemy wore it. Caligula laughed. An audience laughed because thunder had laughed. An old Roman memory of Antony's laughter and Cleopatra's barge shivered in the room like a draft. You pretend you do not feel. What happened next belongs to the black ledger Rome kept locked by habit. A dagger in a corridor or a charge signed in triplicate each has the same consequence. Ptolemy died, and with him Selene's line on a throne. Mauretania was annexed in the language of order and absorbed in the appetite of empire. The province was divided because Rome believes division is a kind of mercy. A governor hung his portrait where Silenus had once watched over petitions. The paint was still tacky when the first petitions asked for the portrait to be moved lower so people did not strain their necks. Life continues with a cruelty that feels like kindness. You would expect this to be the end of the story. Kingdom extinguished, line cut, Roman seal pressed into soft wax. But endings lie. They die on proclamations. They live in people. In the markets of Caesarea, women still weighed fruit on scales worked in the shape of moons. In workshops, goldsmiths hammered bracelets with tiny lotus buds because that was how you made wrists remember a queen. In back rooms where contracts were signed, a signet ring passed from hand to hand, its face carved with a crescent and a name that had learned to survive in more than one alphabet. In the temple, a priest of Isis, now often careful to sound Roman when a tax collector walked by, sang a hymn that mentioned a daughter who brought light to a far shore. None of this overthrew a governor. All of it overthrew oblivion. Juba did not live long after his son. Grief is a jackal that knows every gate in the body. The palace shutters stayed closed more often, and when they opened, wind-shaped dust traced lines on the floor like early drafts of a history book. Officials learned to answer two titles with Latin endings. The mint turned out coins with Roman faces. The academies debated whether wisdom preferred to be free or safe. A few years later, a minor bureaucrat, proud of his newly correct Latin, ordered Selene's crescent chiseled from a lip. The mason made 3 blows and then stopped, palms on his knees, breathing hard. "It won't come clean," he said. Stone remembers. The bureaucrat ordered plaster. The plaster cracked within a year. People said the sea air was to blame. People said the queen's breath was stronger. People will say anything to keep their dead across the water. In the city where Selene had learned to hold her tongue like a dagger, poets sometimes mentioned her the way you mention a star at dusk there, then gone. Then there again if you half close your eyes. A learned matron, turning the pages of a history that preferred men, told her granddaughter the other version of a girl in chains who walked a street and turned her wrists just enough that the iron looked like bracelets. Of a bride who took an exile and gave him a country. Of a queen who held 3 cultures in her hands and did not drop any. The granddaughter fell asleep and dreamed of a crescent sailing over a sea not unlike the color of bronze. In Alexandrius, the city that lost Herculers, swore that, on certain nights, the moon threw a path on the water that aimed not toward Rome but toward the far west. Old men on stools, said the goddess, loved to play tricks. Younger men, said the goddess, remembered a daughter. A woman lighting a lamp in a house that had survived 3 empires and would survive another 3 smiled, and told the lamp to burn for the queen whose mother had taught her not to be afraid of fire. Legacy is the art of being stubborn after you cannot argue back. Selene had understood that when she placed Isis beside Jupiter, when she let coins carry a crescent into a butcher's hand, when she had architects set thresholds so well that governors tripped only once, she had rebuilt a lost kingdom on the edge of an empire that believed edges are maps. Apologies. The empire took the kingdom. It could not take the lesson. Somewhere a girl with ink on her fingers learned Latin declensions and Greek verbs and a word in her mother's tongue, and did not apologize for any of them. Somewhere a boy walked a harbor and counted ships and knew 2 of them by their shadows. Somewhere a mason, old now, ran his thumb over a shallow groove and felt moonlight where the chisel had failed. The day a young administrator finally ordered Selene's portrait removed from a council chamber, the workmen found behind it a painting older than Rome's eye. Lotus and papyrus, a line of blue, the exact color of memory when you try too hard. They covered it in fresh plaster, the way a liar covers a pulse. A week later, a crack appeared like a smile, drawn by a hand that had learned patience. The clerk made a note on durable papyrus. The note has long since gone to dust. The crack is still there. This is how kingdoms endure when the map says otherwise, not as banners on a hill, but as phrases people cannot quite stop using, as rituals small enough to slip past the guards, as habits that become inheritance. Selene's fight to rebuild a lost kingdom did not end with her last breath. It continued wherever someone believed 2 truths could live together: Rome and Nottrum, exile and home, daughter and queen. When the tide is low, the harbor steps of Caesarea show where at exactly the places a careful person would set a foot. If you descend in evening, you can watch the crescent pick itself out of the water, like a coin risen to the surface after a long, purposeful dive. Toss a wish. You do not need to say it aloud. The queen was always good at hearing what people did not say. History loves thunder. It writes itself around battles and beheadings, around decrees that change calendars and fires that redraw borders. But the most dangerous force in history is quieter. It's continuity, the way a story refuses to leave the room even after the narrator is gone. Cleopatra Selene did not live to see the last acts her life set into motion, but she authored their grammar. The empire would play at authorship. The empire would forget to check who sharpened the quills. In Rome, after Ptolemy's death and Mauretania's annexation, the Senate debated how to speak of the change. Conquest did not suit the elegance of a city that had named its hunger order, so they called it settlement and integration, and the natural evolution of administration, phrases that hold meaning the way a sieve holds water. A province was born, another title for another man, another chain cleaned to shine like a bracelet. The maps sowed their little sigh and were recopied with fresh ink and the same old certainty. If parchment could smirk, it would have. On the ground, the empire's methods were instruction and omission. Instruction: new tax schedules, Roman weights, Latin terms for long-known things. Omission, the quiet removal of names that might wake ghosts. Officials avoided Selene in official notices, the way a household avoids speaking of a storm still forming beyond the horizon. But the people who had lived under her rule were not parchment. They did not need Latin to know what their hands knew. An old merchant named Philin, Greek by blood, African by habit, Roman by necessity, kept his ledgers in 3 scripts because he trusted different parts of his mind to different alphabets. In the Greek columns, profits and losses read like a poem of tides. In the Latin columns, taxes marched like soldiers. In the third, written with a reed cut, as his mother had cut hers in Alexandria, were notes that did not travel well, which shipmasters loved their crews, which magistrate's wife had a soft spot for market girls, which days the wind felt like Egypt, even on this coast. One evening he added a line in that third hand. The moon over the harbor looked like the queen's coin. A boy asked if the queen would return. He paused, then wrote because adding a line to a page is a kind of courage. Yes, he was not lying. He was speaking the language of legacy, which counts as true anything that can still change you. The new governor, who wished to be thought efficient an adjective. Romans loved as others love, blessed, decided to reward towns that embraced Roman forms more eagerly. Libraries received copies of Virgil bound in leather that smelled like compromise. Temples dedicated to provincial deities found themselves reorganized, a word that can mean almost anything when spoken by power. Statues suspected of encouraging foreign nostalgia were moved to courtyards with worse light. In Caesarea's main square, there stood a statue of a seated queen, once garlanded, on the day taxes were remitted. The plaque had long ago lost letters to sea air, but enough remained for anyone with basic literacy to read Sel, the governor's aide, who admired straight lines the way a child admires sweets, ordered the statue moved to a side street for restoration. On the morning appointed, workers wrapped the figure in cloth and tightened ropes. A crowd gathered, not protesting. Protest is a luxury, but watching with the attention you give a surgeon's hand. As the cart rolled, the cloth slid, and for a moment the queen's face looked out at her city again, unblinded. Someone clapped one pair of hands. The foreman scowled. The cart wheel struck a rut and stuck there, axle deep, as if the street remembered how to hold. It took 3 hours to lift it free. By then, the aide had somewhere else to be. The statue remained where it was. Restoration can be such an unpredictable craft further along the coast. At Isle, a mason repaired war-scarred steps of a temple that had long since been renamed from what it was. As he worked, he uncovered an inlay, a crescent moon made from shell and mother of pearl, set so cunningly into stone that it seemed to float. He looked around, saw no one worth fearing, and left it uncovered. The overseer, when he inspected the job, made a note to report unauthorized ornament. He lost the scrap of vellum in a tavern later that night. The crescent stayed, catching morning light, teaching passersby that things buried do not always agree to remain so. In a villa near the river Malucha, a family kept a box wrapped in linen and silence. In it lay a necklace, a delicate chain with a pendant shaped like the moon just before it turns to a smile. The story went that the queen herself had given it to an ancestor who could not pay a tax 1 year and paid in taels instead. Queens know the value of a good story. When a child in the family asked why the necklace was not worn, the grandmother answered, because some jewelry is for remembering, not for showing. The child grew up and showed it anyway the day her husband went to plead a case before a magistrate. He won. You tell me whether the moon swung in the balance plate or in the heart. The difference is academic. Selene's legacy also traveled along roads Rome itself laid. Merchants carried her memory the way pollen travels, unintended, purposeful. In Volubilis, a young artisan crafted oil lamps with a tiny crescent on the handle. He claimed it fit better in a hand. Buyers claimed the light behaved kindly. A cohort stationed north sent a lamp home to a mother who had never seen the sea. She set it beside her household gods and said the light reminded her of a story she had heard as a girl, of a princess who had walked through a city and taught iron how to look like grace. Rome did what Rome does. It sent men with ledgers and men with lances. It measured, yield, weighed, loyalty, corrected names. It called the past superstition when it interfered with present receipts, and called it heritage when it decorated speeches. But the empire was changing too. The gods it had insisted were sufficient every day began to share shrines with another name. In that weave of devotions, Selene's careful work, never claiming divinity, always claiming dignity, left a gap through which generations slipped. People practiced remembering in public without triggering the alarm that once brought down her mother. Some said the queen loved the new faith, seeing in its candles and bread and water a grammar her ancestors would have understood. Others said the queen would have preferred old rites under new roofs. A few with serious faces said it did not matter what the queen would have thought, because the queen was dead. The most serious faces are not always worth the most. Across the sea, in Alexandria, a scholar with salt in his beard copied a line from an older text into the margin of a newer one. Do not believe that all is lost when one city falls. Sometimes a city travels into a person, and then into another city. He had no idea how widely that sentence would travel in the centuries. After his own bones laced dust, he wrote it because he missed a queen who had once sent him a gold coin with a crescent on it and a letter, correcting his calculation of Saturn's motion. He kept the coin. He corrected the calculation. He outlived 2 governors and a rumor that the library would be protected forever. He knew better than to trust rumors, and in Rome, where marble believes it is the only stone that matters, stories of Selene turned to something like fashion. A playwright staged a tragedy about a queen who never raised her voice and made kings speak more quietly when she looked at them. The censors fidgeted always, a good sign, then allowed it, comforted by the ending in which the queen's country became a province, as if that tidy conclusion were a proof of the empire's argument. But in the second act there was a scene where the queen taught a child to measure stars with a knotted cord, and after the play people bought cords in the market and measured anything they could tie. Sometimes influence acts like a joke you cannot stop telling a generation later. When children in Mauretania learned their letters, teachers scratched Latin on wax, and when the inspector left early, taught a little Greek, and when the shutters could be closed for a moment, traced the curve of a crescent and said, "This is a letter to," though no alphabet claims it. The children copied it in the margins of their sums. A boy drew it on his sword belt in the army and said it kept him steady in night watches. A girl carved it into the underside of a table, and no one discovered it until the table was moved to a new house where a woman needed a reason to stay and found one. It would be tidy to say. Selene's legacy, one that memory defeated map. That crescent outlasted eagle, tidy and untrue. Rome's walls held long enough to be called eternal in the mouths of those who refused to look at calendars. Provinces paid, governors governed. The annexation wrote itself into generations like a tattoo you learn to ignore. The truth is less triumphant and more miraculous. Selene's legacy did not win. It persisted. It learned the art her mother could not, the discipline of the second glance, the patience of the oblique path. It stepped aside when power stamped through, then stepped back when the heel lifted. It made itself small and therefore vast. One evening in late summer, on a day when the heat lay on the city like a hand you could not politely brush away, an old woman walked to the harbor steps with a bundle under her arm. She had been a girl the day the statue stuck in the rut. The memory had never left her. She opened the bundle and drew out a thin disk of gold pressed flat by time, its face rubbed but visible. A woman's profile, and beside it a crescent. She set it on the stone and waited for the moon to rise. When it did, the gold learned again what it had always wanted to know, how to reflect. The woman whispered something to the coin, or to the water, or to the queen. Then she picked it up and threw it far. It turned 3 times like a thought and sank. She did not watch for it to rise. Faith is not a bargain. Years upon years later enough, years for languages to change their clothes and borders, to forget their grandparents' men. With spades and notebooks came to the fields where cities had slept. They brushed dirt from coins and mosaics and bones. In the rubble of a collapsed wall, they found a tile with a crescent scratched into wet clay by a hand that could not resist leaving a proof. A scholar measured the curve, wrote an article, and declared the mark likely decorative. A student read the article and felt a heat rise in her chest that no footnote could cool. She booked passage to see the tile. She stood in the sun and cried without embarrassment. She wrote nothing for a year. Then she wrote a book about a queen who had taught a country to remember itself softly. If you want a single image to hold, imagine this. A little girl in Rome once walked in chains behind a chariot. People shouted. Musicians played triumph. At a bend in the road, she lifted her face and saw the moon hanging above the forum, invisible to anyone who thought power was measured only in noise. She did not smile, not then. She simply looked until the shape of it burned onto her sight, so that even in the darkest camp, even in a lamplit room, learning Latin even on a day she said yes to a marriage that was both exile and beginning, she could close her eyes and find it. Later, when she could mint coins, she asked the die cutter to carve that shape beside her name. He did. The coin traveled farther than her body. The shape traveled farther than the coin. A kingdom fell. A queen rebuilt. An empire annexed. A story refused to obey. You live in its wake.